So I'm joined by Michael Hicks, and we're going to be talking about his game, The Path of Motus. So thank you, Michael, for taking a little bit of time to talk about this game and your background as an indie dev.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk more in depth about things.
Great. So to get this rolling, why don't, for people that don't know what The Path of Motus is, give us a pitch for the game in your own words.
So it's a game where your words have the power to destroy people. Modus is the goblin that you play as, and he's from a village that's been trapped in a forest for hundreds of years. No one's found a way out, but he thinks he'll be the first one to get through by building these bridges through the forest. So there's some puzzle elements there. But as he builds the bridges, he meets bullies that use their own words to stop him. So there's a verbal combat system where they're shouting words at you, and you have to fire words back and deal with them. So it's definitely a puzzle platformer with some. I'd say it's a very story-heavy game. A lot of focus on like more poetic things in the story and so on. I try to tie the gameplay into all of that. So yeah, that's the basic pitch of it. Yeah.
Great. So I hoped first we could talk about kind of the inspiration for this game, because it's got a pretty, I guess poignant is the word I'd use. Story from your standpoint of why you're making this game and what you want to do with it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I actually had the idea for this game back when I was in college, and this was back in like 2012 when I came up with the idea for it. And it started off almost like a kind of an intellectual inspiration. Like I was playing a lot of games and getting a little frustrated because I was playing stuff like Skyrim and all these games where it has like the 300-hour grind, and I was watching movies and music that were doing what I thought was very kind of thoughtful or perspective-changing things in a couple of hours. And I was like, man, I wish I could play a game that kind of tackled more serious subject matter or kind of challenged my views on real-life topics and did it in more of a condensed way, I guess. Because I feel like when I'm playing these games, I'm just grinding and for nothing, I feel like, just for some piece of armor. So it started off with a frustration, and then I was like, well, let me see if I can maybe try and design a game that does what I want. So that's how it started. Then I started thinking more and more about what I wanted to actually do. And I started thinking about, well, games are about challenge, and it would be cool if I could make a game about like a little guy that's trying to like pursue his dreams and do something really difficult in his life, and I could play into the gameplay. Because the one thing I knew for sure I wanted to do is I wanted to express whatever I wanted to express in a way that was unique to games. Because I feel like a lot of times the games that do try to do this, they rely on cutscenes or more traditional narrative approaches. I wanted the gameplay to be the main driver of the message or whatever I was trying to do, right? So eventually, I started thinking about all this stuff, and I came up with the basic idea of you're this guy trying to pursue his dreams of getting through the forest by building the bridges, and it would be a very challenging type of experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you mentioned the gameplay playing into the narrative and kind of the storyline, because that's one of the things in what I've played of the game that really stuck out to me is there's a wonderful interplay between the message of the narrative and what you're doing with your actions in the game.
Yeah.
That was really cool. And I think the kind of the standout example of that is that verbal combat system you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the most standout things about Path of Motus. It's certainly like kind of one of the most eye-grabbing, attention-grabbing things when you first see it. So where did that particular mechanic kind of evolve from? Was it always something you had planned with Path of Motus? Did it start early in development, or is it something that kind of gestated a little later?
Well, the initial inspiration for why I put that in there was like when I came up with this game, I was in the middle of trying to pursue indie games. I had already released a few games, and I kind of had an idea of like anybody who tries to go and pursue some type of dream, usually there's a lot of people that think you're crazy and a lot of it'll never happen type of thing. So I was like, well, that needs to be in there. We need some type of verbal representation of that. So that was the initial like conceptual inspiration, but the mechanic has actually went through a lot of iterations. So in the very original game that I made, like the prototype or whatever, back in 2012, originally there was only one word. I guess I should explain. In the final version, you can fire 3 different words,
Right.
Kind of like a Simon type of thing. But in the original one, there was only one word you fired, and it was actually a charge mechanic. So the longer you thought about your words, the more powerful they were.
Oh, okay.
And I thought that was clever,
That is
but
clever.
Gameplay-wise, I didn't think it worked out very well because it kind of boiled down to the same thing, and there wasn't enough enough juice in it. So when I came back to do the remake of the game, I scrapped that. I was like, okay, we need no more charge. I need to think of a different way. And naturally, I just thought about, well, it'd be cool if you could fire different words and maybe almost have like a conversation kind of with the enemies. If you in the game, I think they yell, what is it? They yell stop, and then your response to that is why. So it's very simplistic, kind of back and forth conversation. But that's how it evolved. And then at that point, the first iteration of that, a lot of the gameplay in the game was a whole lot of sequence matching. So you would match like 5 or 6 words in like one little setting. And eventually I decided that I didn't like that either because it just wasn't interesting enough. I liked the matching of the 3 words, but I decided that the word matching would be kind of a cherry on top, and each section of the game would be exploring a different idea in the combat, right? So it wasn't. What was cool to me in the final version of this game is not that, oh, you match a bunch of words, but there's different kind of, it's almost like a puzzle-like combat system.
Yeah.
Each section, you have to approach it slightly different. And that to me is what's interesting about the combat. And the matching of the words is kind of like the cherry on top. So yeah, it went through like 3 or 4 different iterations before we got to this point. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's cool to see how that has evolved. I love that you said it's like puzzle combat, because that's exactly what I felt when I was playing it.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is kind of like, it's one part combat, one part, shooting words at people, and one part you got to think on your feet a little bit. But speaking of puzzles, as you mentioned, there's a large element of puzzles in Path of Motus, in both the bridges you're building through the environment and then kind of these like roadblock side puzzles. And puzzle games are something I particularly love. I'm kind of a puzzle head. So I always like to ask developers that are making puzzles how they go about building them, because it's the one thing that still, even having talked to a lot of developers, still confuses me. I'm like, wait, how do you even start building a puzzle? Like, where do you go? Where do you start? So what's your methodology on building this puzzle? So people know. I think I'll have some video up of one of these puzzles in the Path of Motus, but the main mechanic is you have a number of nodes and a number of lines that have to connect to those nodes for them to be, for lack of a better word, happy. And your goal is to make all the nodes happy and thus solve the puzzle. It's a type of puzzle I'd not really seen used in any other game, so I'm interested to see where you got that.
Well, I feel like maybe there's 2 different questions, right? Like, what was the original concept of like this specific mechanic, and then how do I design the actual puzzles? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's spot on.
Okay, I'll start with the conceptual part of that then. So originally I knew that I wanted the character to be building bridges. So it started off with like, okay, the story, I want him to be building bridges. How can I do that? And originally I thought of those old school Flash games. Can't think of the name of some of them, but the physics-based bridge games.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So originally I was like, okay, I'd like to go in that direction, but I don't really want to go the physics direction. Maybe they can be more puzzle-like. And I think what I did was I Googled bridge puzzles, and I found an old Japanese puzzle type. I believe it's called Hashi or something like that. If you Google it, you'll find it. But the basic mechanic of the line drawing, that's actually taken from this old Japanese puzzle.
That's very cool.
But I end up kind of, But I end up kind of putting my own spin on it. I changed it's similar, but when you look at the puzzles in the final game, I kind of put my own spin. I'd say I copied it, but in an original way.
Sure,
I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's all art is in a sense, copying.
Yeah, basically, else. So then that was the inspiration for the bridge building. But as I went along on the remake, there's also the thought doors, I call them. And it's the same basic idea. There's these puzzles on the doors, and you draw the lines, and whatever the number is on the node, that's how many lines it needs. But my approach for these was a little different, because I wanted the puzzles to express what was going on in Motus's mind in the story. And I wanted a way... I thought that it could work because puzzles, they always have a very specific solution. So my mentality was I can express a very specific idea using puzzle mechanics.
That makes sense.
So what I ended up doing is like each door has a different kind of theme. So in the cave, which is the first side area that you find in the game, the theme is isolation, like Motus is feeling very isolated. And the way that I designed the puzzles on that door is that naturally what most people do is they start trying to isolate the nodes into like 2 different partitions. Because just the way that they're laid out, people try to do that. And then it kind of like a piece of the poem that you read earlier about being isolated plays, and usually people have like a bit of an aha moment, like, oh, I can't be isolated. It kind of links back to the poem, and so each one of those doors has a similar kind of approach. Each of the doors has a different thematic, I guess you could say, and how that they're designed. So that's kind of linking into the second question. I designed these puzzles to express like very specific ideas. So in the cave, isolation. Later on in the game, like different. Well, I don't want to spoil it. I think people get the idea. Play the game to get the rest of it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I had specific ideas for each one of those doors, and the bridges too had specific ideas. So how I got to these solutions, I really can't. It's like trying to explain like the creative process.
Sure.
It's something I can't really. Like a lot of times, I'll just be throwing stuff on the screen, and then the right things just start to come together, and I have that aha moment, like, oh, I can see how this can work. I can't really explain it, unfortunately. Yeah,
no, that's fine. Yeah, and if this sounds interesting at all, I would encourage you to go check out Path of Motus. We'll have links in the description below to the Steam page and to the website. That is, I think, one of the most standout things about the game I've found is that the puzzles are not just puzzles, but they really do integrate with kind of a message that the story is telling, which I think is really cool. So turning from talking about the Path of Motus specifically, I'd love to know kind of what your story was in getting involved in independent game design.
Well, I played games growing up, and I loved Star Wars. I played a bunch of like space shooter games, like Star Wars Rogue Squadron, stuff like that. And it started off in a very kind of innocent way. I just wanted to mimic those types of games. So my first couple of games were kind of space shooter, trying to be like Star Wars Rogue Squadron types of games. And I taught myself programming by studying things online. At first, when I started doing this, I kind of thought programming and design was the same thing, which it's not. So my first games were pretty much like, oh, hey, let's see if we can get a bunch of ships on the screen, and that's cool, and let's ship that. I didn't think much deeper about the design until later. But yeah, like I said earlier, I think I mentioned the story earlier, like in college, I kind of had a second thought about what I was doing with my designs, and it just kind of grew from there. So it started off very, I wanted to mimic games I liked, but then just grew and grew to games like Motus. So
you mentioned obviously Rogue Squadron being kind of like an inspiration, but were there any other games that kind of really got your design juices flowing, like kind of like that stand out to you as a linchpin to get you into the world of making games?
Well, I mean, later on, I started discovering like Jonathan Blow stuff, like Braid and The Witness, and I feel like he's probably had him and Jason Rohrer. He made Passage and another game called Gravitation. Those two designers definitely had like the biggest inspiration or influence on me and how I approach all of this stuff. I remember it was funny because I started having all these thoughts about, man, I wish I could play games that did, like I was talking about earlier, like more meaningful things or whatever. And I ended up kind of discovering all of Jason's stuff. I think he had like 7 or 8 games out, and I played Gravitation, and that was a big moment for me as a designer because it really changed the way I looked at everything. And to this day, I still think I don't know, I still hold it up as probably one of the best games that really communicate things in a unique way that only games can. I would point to Gravitation. And The Witness, actually, when I played The Witness, I was expecting what it did with puzzles to be what I was describing with those doors, and it wasn't quite like that. He took like a little bit of a different approach. So the Witness inspired Motus, but in a different way. Like he inspired me to go back and be like, okay, he didn't do what I thought he was going to do with The Witness, so I'm going to do that in my game with my door puzzles, basically.
That's a funny connection. Cool. The one thing we always ask every developer we talk to is we love to know what other indie games have captured your attention. So maybe you can give us a shout out to a couple other indie devs or indie games that are kind of in the works now or have just come out that people might have missed.
So my favorite game that I played this year is A Case of Distrust, and I showed next to this game at PAX East. Really great story game. I was a big fan of LA Noire, and this game kind of gives me that vibe with a very nice, distinct art style, great music. I would highly recommend that game. If you're into story-based games, definitely go there. In terms of like games I played that I found to be like really innovative or groundbreaking, the last one I can think of was this game called Corrupt by Michael Bro, and it's a free download. It was nominated for some IGF awards a few years back. That's actually where I ran into him. I was at the GDC that year. He was nominated, and that's how I found the game. And at first, it's very inaccessible at first. You think it's just like, oh, a really hard puzzle game. But by the very end of it, like your mind's like completely blown. It's like nothing else I've ever played. I don't want to spoil it, but basically he created like a whole new genre of puzzles with that game. I think it's called Crypt, but I think it's spelled with Y. I think it's like CORYYPT or something like that. But yeah, I'd recommend that game too.
Awesome. Yeah. Those are two really good suggestions. I'm glad you mentioned Case of Distrust. I played that at PAX East. I'm about halfway through playing it, and I've loved it as a fan of noir.
Yeah, that's great.
So that would be a good excuse for me to reach out to Ben Wander and see if I can pick his brain. Awesome. Well, Michael, thank you for taking a little bit of time to talk to us about kind of your design philosophy behind the Path of Motus and your history. So the Path of Motus will be out this month. We'll have a link, as I said, to the Steam store page. So please go check that out. Put it on your wish list. Buy it if you're watching this after it's released. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I had a good time.
And you go. Looked for you so close, but now you're far away. So far, far away from here. Where did you go?